Hello, thank you for joining me in my season two. Well, I'm very excited to have you here. You are really an inspiration, and I really want to know about your journey, and so is my listeners.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, how are you? How are you coping up your life with COVID-19?
Well, I think we're all doing the best we can. Certainly, here in the US, different states have been under different levels of quarantine for the whole, we're up to 414 days here in New Jersey. But I think with vaccinations happening at a pretty rapid pace, like here in my home state of New Jersey, we've had 7 million people receive at least one dose. And I think it's 4 million people are fully vaccinated. And in the US, 100 million people are fully vaccinated at this point. So I think we'll start to see the numbers come down for sure. Although, there are hot spots throughout the country here, like in Michigan, for example. And
Yes,
obviously,
the whole world is battling right now.
right. And certainly our experience is nothing like what is going on in India right now. So,
Yeah.
But, for the most part, my life didn't change terribly much because I'm a writer. I work from home anyway. So I was home, and my three children, two of my three children were, one is, grown and flown, lives on her own in Chicago. And my middle son is in college, even though university is, more was online this year. He was away. And my husband had to get used to working from home. So, but other than kind of having to wear masks when you go out to, the store or wherever, life is starting to get a little more normalized for us anyway.
Yes, it's like good for you to spend more time with your family right now.
Well, I don't know if they'd say that.
Yes. So can you tell us a little more about your journey? How were you diagnosed and when did you find out?
Sure. So I'm a two-time cancer survivor. So we'll start with the more recent diagnosis. In 2016, I went for my annual mammogram, and I waited to get the results back as I did every year. And I'd probably been getting mammograms since I was in my mid-30s. Because, very early on, my doctor said, you need to just start your mammos early. So, and the I'm sitting there waiting for, the nurse or the tech to come in with the reminder card for next year. And in walks the radiologist. And I was like, oh no, this can't be good. And she said to me, you have a junky cyst. She's like, I don't like how it looks. You need to have it biopsied. So of course I asked, is it breast cancer? And she's like, I can't tell you that. That's why you have to have it biopsied. So I went and I scheduled my biopsy. And on a perfectly ordinary night in March 2016, it was actually March 2nd, was the day before my middle son's 15th birthday. The phone rang. And, I heard the words I never wanted to hear again in my life, which were, I'm sorry, you have breast cancer. And my doctor said, it's going to take a few weeks for us to figure out a treatment plan. We have to do additional pathology, all this other stuff. So, but in that kind of moment of ordinary, right? My youngest son, who was 10 at the time, was doing his homework. Dinner was on the stove. I was setting the table so we, could sit down and eat. The timeline of my life just broke, right? And I knew that because as a teenager, I had Hodgkin's disease, which is what Hodgkin's lymphoma was called back in the 1980s. And when I was diagnosed, my oncologist, my parents sat down with me and they said, okay, you have this blood disease, and you're going to have a tough couple of months ahead of you, and then you're going to be fine. And the strangest thing about that is, as I recall those conversations I had as a teenager, was that nobody ever said I had cancer. The word just was not used, which was a function of the times, partly, I think, but I also think it was probably my parents wanting to protect me from something like really scary. So, so I had a splenectomy, and then I went for radiation therapy 4 days a week. And at the time, we lived in a borough of New York City called Staten Island, which is a little island out in New York Harbor. And the only hospitals you could go to for radiation therapy were in New York City. And so my parents drove me 4 days a week from Staten Island to New York City for treatment. So it was basically, a whole morning every day, 4 days a week. And on the other day, I went to school. On the middle day of the week when I didn't have treatment, I went to my high school. And the weirdest thing was, I couldn't understand why I had to go to this hospital where people were really, really sick, didn't have any hair, or hooked up to IVs. And I just had this blood disease and I didn't feel sick at all. So it was like this cognitive sort of disconnect I had. And when it was over as a teenager, my family didn't talk about it. I didn't talk about it. I just wanted to go back to being a normal teenager, and life went on. And when I was 21, my oncologist saw me for the last time. He told me to get out of his office and go live my life. And he said, one more thing, start your mammograms early. And at 21, I didn't have the prescience, or I wasn't smart enough to ask him why. I just filed it away and said, well, I'll deal with that, in 10 years when I'm in my 30s. So, but, I followed his advice religiously, and I started my mammograms early, and, thank goodness I did, because, what that did was he saved my life, not just once, but twice, because I followed his advice. That's how important that was to do. So flash forward 35 years from that point in time to when I was diagnosed with breast cancer. So I ended up having to have chemotherapy. So I had 6 cycles of chemo. I had a bilateral mastectomy and implant reconstruction, and 8 additional cycles of a targeted therapy. So for all in, it was a year of treatment for me. And today, I'm healthy, and life is good. So I'm very grateful.
Yes, I can totally see you. You are happy right now in your life and also healthy. It's actually very important to have family support in such times. So what was it difficult for you to tell your kids about your diagnosis? How did mental health affect you and your family during the treatment?
Well, to answer the first question, yes, it was very, very hard to tell my children. And, the funny thing is, when my husband and I first married, one of the things we were really emphatic about being was, open and honest. His family are big communicators. So you tell anybody in his family anything, somebody else will know about it in like 2 seconds. My family was very different than that. We were not big communicators. So we really wanted to, make sure we didn't, or I felt like I didn't want to make the same mistakes with my kids that I felt my parents made with me. And then I found out I had cancer. And so we decided we'd tell our 3 children. My oldest daughter was 19 at the time. She was a freshman in university, so first year in university. My middle son was 15 and he was in his first year of high school. And my youngest son was 10 and still in primary school. So we said, well, when we get all the information, diagnosis, treatment plan, everything, we'll sit everybody down, we'll have a family, collective moment, and answer their questions, you know, kind of grieve together as a family and reassure them that I was going to be okay. And while that sounded like a great idea at the time, that's not exactly how it played out. So, and I won't get into too many of the details, but the upshot was that, you know, my daughter ended up finding out from my husband, who told her while my son and I were 100 miles away at a swim meet, and there was a lot of drama and a lot of hurt, a lot of hurt. My daughter felt really betrayed that I didn't tell her as I had found out the information instead of waiting. And kind of ironically, the American Cancer Society, you know, has a whole web page on telling your children. And one of the things they say is that you should prepare to have multiple conversations with your kids, you know, over time, and not do what I tried to do, which was totally control the narrative and control everything. As far as, you know, mental health goes, I think one of the most important things is that, you know, and I say this is the opening of my book, is that an individual doesn't get cancer, a family does. So the disease isn't just something that affects the person who has it, it affects the entire family. You know, it affects the kids, certainly affected my spouse, or will affect your partner. And caregivers a lot of times, you know, are kind of forgotten, you know, in the midst of like all the care that's being given to the person who's sick. You know, you don't think about, or maybe not as often as you should, think about what the disease is doing to the people who love you, you know, who care for you. And it certainly affected my middle son deeply. He got very withdrawn. He slept a lot. He didn't want to be around me. You know, at one point he told me, you know, I had become a monster to him. And part of that was that we had lost his grandfather a couple of years prior to prostate cancer. And my son was very, very close to him. And so I think he had a very hard time, you know, reconciling those two things. Like, is mom going to die? Because she looks just like granddad did when he was really sick. You know, I didn't have any hair. It was just, you know. But what ended up happening, you know, was that my son really fell into a major depression, you know, that wasn't diagnosed for about a year. And we, you know, thankfully got him into treatment, and, you know, he's fine today. He's happy and healthy. But, you know, I missed that as his mother, you know, which was shocking and painful to like realize. And because as a parent, you know, you want to protect your children, right? That's your, you know, your first instinct, right, is to protect them and make sure they're safe and loved and cared for. And he, you know, he told me, he's like, I didn't want to tell you because I didn't think you could handle it. So my teenager was trying to protect me. And, you know, that was really heartbreaking to hear. So what I like to tell or suggest to families, if they find themselves in a situation where, you know, a loved one is ill, a parent or caregiver is ill, make sure you keep an eye on the kids. And if you can't do it, ask your friends, your neighbors, their teachers, their coaches, you know, other important adults in their life, to keep an eye on them, because you might miss something because you're so wrapped up in your own, you know, illness and everything else. So
Everyone had to support each other while your treatment. It's totally understandable. That is what family is all about. So
absolutely.
what treatments did you undergo? How was life battling cancer twice?
Well, so as a breast cancer patient, I had what's called triple positive breast cancer, which means I was positive for hormone receptors, estrogen and progesterone, and another receptor called, I'm just going to give the abbreviation, it's called HER2, HER2. And the way my oncologist explained it to me, he said, the estrogen and the progesterone, which are hormones your body makes, are basically like fuel to your cancer cells, right? And HER2 is another type of fuel. And what the chemotherapeutic agents that are used to treat this particular kind of cancer do is cut those fuel lines, right? And it shrinks the tumors and the tumors go away. So I went through neoadjuvant chemotherapy on Taxotere, carboplatin, Herceptin, and Perjeta. So it's called TCHP here. That's the protocol here. And like I said, I had breast surgery. I chose to have a bilateral mastectomy, even though they could only detect cancer in one breast at the time. And I was so adamant that I couldn't bear the thought of like putting everybody through this again if it ever came back. So I wanted to have a bilateral, and it's a good thing I did, because my surgical pathology showed post-surgery that there was DCIS, ductal carcinoma in situ, which is sort of the pre-cancer cancer, so it would have just been a matter of time, really. So I'm glad I chose that route, and I had reconstruction, and if I stood up and you looked at me, you would never know, so, and I had a great plastic surgeon, so, my surgery went, really well. But, there are many components to recovering from cancer. And one of the important things that I came to learn was, my mental health was really affected by going through this twice. And for probably the first year after I finished treatment, I was so anxious and so afraid of recurrence. And every time I had to go to the doctors, my family all, cringed, because I'd lose my temper. I was really short with everybody. And finally, my husband said, you got to stop. You've got to go see somebody, because we can't live like this. We can't walk on eggshells in the house feeling like, any moment you're going to lose it because you're so anxious. So I did. And I went into therapy, and I had to kind of go back and deal with all the Hodgkin's memories that I never really dealt with as a teenager, some of which were very, frightening and scary. But once I, looked at them in the light of day and opened up the box, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, I was free of that. They're just memories now. They're nothing for me to be actively afraid of. So that was really important. That a lot of times people will say, well, treatment's over, aren't you glad your life got back to normal and everything is fine? And what most people don't know is that it's not fine. Like, sometimes the hardest part of going through cancer treatment isn't going through the treatment, it's learning to live with being a survivor afterwards. And as a long-term Hodgkin's survivor, I'm dealing with, the long-term side effects of the treatment that I received, because back in 1980, the radiation treatments were, far less sophisticated than they are today. My heart was damaged from the radiation, so I ended up having to have a valve replaced in 2019 because it had calcified because of the radiation. I have to have my thyroid watched because the field for the radiation that I received was basically from here to like my diaphragm. So it was my whole chest area. So I have to watch my thyroid, I have to watch my lungs, there's all this other long-term stuff I just have to have monitored. And thank God I have great doctors who do that for me. So I'm very, very lucky in that regard.
You are a really strong lady. You fought with all of this with your family. So what inspired you to write again, Surviving Cancer Twice with Love and List? And when did you start writing? Was it difficult for you?
Okay, so when did I start writing? So here's the joke about, again, writing it was quite a journey. But the joke is that again was never supposed to be a book. It was supposed to be a list. So when I was in treatment, and I was almost done with chemo, so this would have been like in the summer of 2016, my nurse, my surgical nurse, ran a cancer support group once a month that I would go to. And one day after one of those meetings, she said, "Hey, Chris, would you mind writing me a list of like some tips or tricks or helpful information that I could share with other patients from a patient's perspective?" And so I said, "Sure, I'd be happy to write you a list." And then I got in my car to go home and I was like, "Why did you agree to do that? That was a terrible thing to agree to do," because I was in the middle of my own, experience. I was like, what am I going to tell somebody else? Um, so I ignored her request for months. I ignored it. And after I had recovered from surgery, my sense of obligation got the better of me. So I sat down, I was like, all right, I'm gonna write Karen her list. And once I started writing, I couldn't stop. And it took me about 3 months, 2, 3 months. And I ended up with 10 essays, short essays. It was about 35 pages of text. And I called it What I Know Now. And I sent it to her. And she emailed me back and she's like, "This is awesome, but it's not a list." And that set of essays that I wrote very, very close in time to all the events that had happened sort of served as the backbone or the beginning of writing again. And so, at the time I was writing that list for Karen, I had also just turned 50 and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do in this post-cancer life of mine. Was I going to go back to work as a lawyer? Was I going to go back to running my own legal writing and editing business that I ran? Or should I do something totally different and write a book? So I said, well, I think I'm going to write this book and take the list and turn it into a book. But I knew that I knew nothing about writing a book. So I ended up taking probably about 2 years of creative writing classes. I joined a writing group. I had a mentor. I went to writing conferences. I had different people read different versions of the manuscript. And so the whole process took about 4 years from beginning to end. By the time I had a finished manuscript in late 2019, so it was right before COVID happened. I had it professionally edited. I did a book proposal. I was, out pitching publishers and agents and such. And then
and now you are the best-selling author. You inspired.
And then COVID happened. So I chose actually the worst year to have a book published in. But ultimately, it's been a great journey and a great experience. And there were certainly parts of the book that were very hard to rate. I cried a lot when I wrote the book. And there's still parts of the book that if I read today, I'd probably still cry about. But and so it was a journey for me, and it was also a journey for my family, because when I floated the idea of writing a book, my teenage son was just like, just stop. No one wants to hear about your breast cancer. Just stop talking about it. And when the book finally came out last October, and he texted me from college and he's like, "I saw the book came out." He goes, "And that is really cool." So, he kind of came around. And my youngest son, who's now a sophomore, second year in high school, tells his teachers and his friends, he's like, my mom's an author. So even though he was little, or not little, but he was much younger when all this was happening, I think he's even a little proud of it too. So that's nice.
Of course, your book is very inspiring, and that's why you are the best publisher today. So, can you tell us a little more about Again Surviving the Cancer Twice with Love and Lust?
Sure. So, one of, beside the joke part, like why it should have been a list and not a book. But when I was first diagnosed, I really wanted, like, I'm a book person. Like, if I move the camera, you would see all my stacks of books here in my office. And I wanted a book that was going to tell me how I was going to deal with this disease as an ordinary woman, wife and mom. I'm not, and I went looking for that book. And there were plenty of memoirs, books written by celebrities who had had cancer. I'm not a celebrity, so that that wasn't going to help me. And I just don't care for those types of books. That's just my preference. There were all sorts of, medical books written by doctors and stuff, and I didn't want that because I have really great doctors. I didn't need to become a second doctor. I just wanted my doctors to take care of me. So my oncologist in particular, he's fabulous. So I also found, plenty of like inspirational type books and, lots of journals with pink ribbons on them, the breast cancer symbol. I don't know if that's a symbol in India, but here in the US, it's the pink ribbon. So, and then I found all these beautiful memoirs written by people who died from cancer. And I was like, I'd go into a bookstore and they're like, here, do you want to read When Breath Becomes Air? I'm like, no, I don't want to read a book by a dead person, thanks. Because that wasn't helpful to me then. They're beautiful memoirs, don't get me wrong. And I've probably read every cancer illness memoir that's been written. If I look at my bookshelves, I probably have every one of them at this point, and I've read them all. And they're gorgeous meditations on the meaning of life and confronting one's mortality. But when you're confronting your mortality, for me, that's not what I wanted to read. What I wanted was a trail map. I wanted like a guidebook. I wanted somebody to say, here is a flashlight to help you get through this, dark. I always visualized it in my head, like walking through, kind of a dark forest, where the light isn't necessarily that clear all the time. And I couldn't find that book. So I decided to write that book so that if somebody else hears those words, I'm sorry you have cancer, that maybe my book will be able to help them, navigate their way through and know that, I like to say more than, the book is more than about cancer. Cancer is just the backdrop for the story, because tons of people get cancer. I think here in the US, the number's like 1.8 million people are diagnosed every year. So it's it's rare to find somebody who doesn't know somebody who's either been personally affected by cancer or knows somebody else about cancer. So it's not really a book about cancer per se. It's really a book about resilience, and it's a book about strength and courage. And, the message I like to impart is that we all have, the strength inside us to face things, even when they're hard and scary. And that, is also certainly the case, I think, for the whole world living through this pandemic. And so to me, the message of the book is one of resilience. And my big sort of life lesson that I learned was, I don't really have, for all the lists I've made in my life, I have no real control over how it's going to turn out anyway. So that's made me, I try to, it's forced me to kind of be more present, more aware of just, the ordinary moments of life, because that's where we do our living, right? It's, we don't all have, fireworks going off all the time. Every day isn't a holiday, but there's beauty. There's beauty and wonder and joy, even in like my morning cup of coffee right here. So, and I try to, keep that sense of presence and not be overwhelmed anymore by the uncertainty of the unknown. So I've tried to get to be a little bit more.
Well, we can see you are doing wonderful.
Talking about, the book. So in addition to kind of weaving my two experiences as a kid, as a teen, and then as adults, those are sort of the first two sections of the book are about, getting diagnosed and then being treated. And then the third section of the book is about sort of little pieces of, I won't call it advice, but what I experienced and, so that practical stuff for people. So, and it runs the gamut from, what to wear when you lose your hair, from wigs to scarves, or, for me, it was a baseball summer, to how do you deal with people who want to give you advice? How do you deal with people's, awkward, like not sure what to say to you kind of, situations. So things that kind of worked for me. So there's some practical kind of, I call it the practical realities sprinkled through the book as well, in addition to my story. So that's kind of the three components of the book. So it's not just a memoir, there's some practical stuff in there as well.
I'm sure that book has inspired many people. And of course, I have read some of the things in it because it is not available in India, but definitely have been seeing a lot many reviews. And I have been knowing this, like the recent book which is launched, Heroics. This title is very bold and I really liked it. So what is your contribution in that book?
Sure. Here, I will show it to you. I know you can get these books on Amazon US, so I don't know how you get them in India. So I could ask my publisher though, find out. But here's Heroics. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Women's Lived Experience During the Coronavirus Pandemic. And it was published in March by Pact Press. And you can buy it directly on their website, Pact Press, and here in the States on all of the, big, on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble, on Book Depository, on, all of the places. So Heroics is an anthology. It's a collection of 52 essays written by women across the United States about their experiences during the pandemic. And the experiences range from, motherhood to being a frontline healthcare worker, to losing, a loved one to COVID, to having a baby during COVID. It just runs the gamut. And the thing that's really great about this anthology is that these essays were written last spring. So the call for submissions went out, I want to say in April of 2020, and the deadline was mid-May. So everyone was writing these essays, right at the peak of the pandemic here in the United States. So the experiences, kind of like when I wrote my original list, were very raw. They're very, very present in the moment that it was all happening, which is what I think makes this collection so interesting. And I think it'll kind of remain interesting because it's going to be a marker for, or placeholder for what it was really like in those early months when none of us knew what we were dealing with, right? So what I contributed to the collection is an essay called Not Back To, but Forward. And it's an essay about how my experiences with cancer helped me deal with the uncertainty of COVID. because I already knew from having gone through cancer twice that uncertainty is kind of your natural state of being. And it, we all want to control things as humans, but the reality is that 98% of the time can't control. So, and in those early days of the pandemic, I kept hearing people say, well, when we get back to normal, when this is all over, when we get back to normal. And it reminded me of being in cancer, in treatment. After I got out of treatment, people would say that to me all the time, aren't you glad treatment's over? You're going to get back to normal. And I knew I wasn't going back to normal. My life had changed, irrevocably it changed. Everything about my life had changed. My life had changed emotionally, mentally, physically, sexually, all changed. So the idea that we were going to go back to what we were pre-COVID was sort of the backbone of the essay. And the essay talks about, learning to live with uncertainty. It talks about, to me, one of the most striking things that the pandemic really brought home here in the States, and I think definitely has brought home globally, because we can see this throughout the world now, is the vast disparity, in healthcare resources. And I can speak just here from my own experience. There was a huge difference between, mortality and survivability, between more affluent, hospitals and hospitals that, were located in urban areas where, people were of a lower income level, different communities. Certainly the pandemic hit communities of color far worse, particularly in the New York metro area. So New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, here in the Northeast. So that to me was one of the things that, we can't go back to that. We have to find a way forward and do it better, so that I think that to me was sort of the call from COVID, like how can we go forward as a country and as a global community and make the world safer and make the resources more widely available and, be more environmentally friendly and all that, and be fair to, the workers who are, in the front lines of all this. So that was the essay that I contributed.
Sure, it sounds very interesting, and I know the book will be very interesting with the title itself says heroics. So what message or advice would you like to give to everyone today?
One thing I think is well, like let's talk first about prevention. All right. So since your podcast is focused on health and wellness, so particularly for young women, do your monthly breast self-examinations every month. Just do them on the first day of the month, and know your body, so that if something doesn't look right or something doesn't feel right, don't ignore it. Go have it looked at. It's really important to have agency, about your health and your body. And so that to me is really important. If you have a family history of any kind of cancer, but breast cancer in particular, talk to your healthcare providers, your doctors or your nurses, about doing early screening. Start your mammograms early so that, you don't, get a diagnosis that's staged much later than it would have been if it had been caught earlier. So, early detection, early screening is it's so important. I go back to like the words that my teenage oncologist said to me, and they just rang true, all the way through. And So that's certainly one thing. So early, screen, self-exams, try to get exercise every day, or multiple times a week if you can. Get outside, fresh air, all that good stuff. I sound like my doctor, but this is my oncologist, whose name is Rashid Abbasi. He I've done Zooms with him for medical groups in Pakistan and Southeast Asia as well. And he always says this stuff. So this is me parroting my oncologist. And try to eat as healthily as possible. So all of these things, I'm sure there are things that your parents have told you. I'm sure you've heard this from other people, but you know yourself the best, right? You know your body the best. And if something is off, if something isn't right, then you need to respect that and try to figure out what it is. Now, it doesn't mean it's cancer, but if you're at least attuned, then you're giving yourself the ability to potentially discover something sooner rather than later. And that's just so important for long-term survivability, especially since at least here in the States, younger and younger women are getting diagnosed. It's not uncommon for women to get diagnosed now in their late 20s, early 30s. So it's not, people always think of cancer as something that affects older women or older men, and it really doesn't. It just kind of cuts across the board at this point. So that's kind of one thing on prevention. And the other thing is just, if you're a caretaker, no one takes care of the caretakers. I said this earlier, right? So be kind to the caretakers. Caretakers need to fill their own cups as well. If they're dealing with illness in the household, or they can't just be doing all the caring. They have to take care of themselves too. So those are kind of my two big pieces of advice. And then the third piece of advice is, people ask me all the time, well, if someone has cancer, what do I do? I don't know what to say. And what I like to remind people is that the person, you don't know what to say, then just say you don't know what to say and listen, because maybe they just want to talk, and listen to what they have to say. And if they're not comfortable sharing information, then respect that boundary, But the thing to remember is that the person who has the diagnosis is the same person you've always known, right? And you've cared about, whether it's a friend, a loved one, a coworker. You know these people. They haven't changed. Their essential self hasn't changed because they got this diagnosis. So it's important to remember that, and not necessarily treat them like they're broken or they're contagious, or they're the same person. They're just a person who has a really crappy disease that they have to deal with. And then if you want, to help, then, make an offer of concrete help and then do it. So whether it's, making them a meal, or giving a caretaker, an hour off by themselves, or helping out with, shuttling kids around, or helping out in the home, whatever, no, you don't have to do. What I found was the smallest gestures, could have been a card or a note, or somebody, left, a plant, or, flowers, or showed up at my front door with a pot of spaghetti, and just handed it to me and went away. These small things help people. You don't have to necessarily do huge grand gestures, but the small things that show you care are the most important, I think. And I saved every single card, every single letter, every single note that I got. I have a basket of them, and I'll keep them for the rest of my life. So
it's really important. Communication is the key, of course, and having people around and talking to them actually is your mental health also. So thank you for sharing your advice and thank you for joining me in the podcast. You're really an inspiring person. And I'm sure your story will help others too.
Thank you so much.